Welcome back to the sixth and final part of the TV watch list in Symfony project, where we're building a Symfony application to manage our TV watch list. And in this last segment, we just need to set up some CRUD controllers so that we can manage our three entity types: our users, our streaming platforms, and our actual watch list shows. We'll be using Easy Admin again to build these CRUD controllers. And so if we go to the CRUD controllers section, we'll see that we simply again need to run a console command, make admin CRUD, and it's going to ask us which entity type we want to work with, and we'll just say number 2 right here. We'll generate it in the default directory. The namespace of the CRUD controller is correct. And so let's look at what this has given us so far. Here's our new user CRUD controller. It's right here. It has some default information. I'll give you a quick warning. This is generic and does not necessarily match our environment. We do have the user, and the user class is named correctly, but we need to go ahead and take care of these property fields by ourselves. So let's go ahead and uncomment this code. But then let's also go back and review our entity type and find out what our actual properties are that go here. Also, you'll notice that we have some ID field, text field, and text editor field classes being used here that are not defined. We will definitely need to do that or things will break. But first, let's look into what fields we need, and then we'll look into the field types needed to represent them and move on from there. So in our user entity, we had the ID, the username, and the roles. So we need to be able to manage all of those things for our users. However, roles is not a text field. It's actually a choice field. Let's jump in and look at the field types we have available to us in Easy Admin real quick. It looks like the best option for roles is going to be a choice field, because that's the one that's going to allow us to specify which roles are available. And we will want to add multiple choices. So for all of these, we need to grab the PHP class that we're going to use and put it up in our use statements. Let's get those for all of our fields right now. We have an ID field, and we have a text field. Although actually, we may not want to edit the ID field. We may only want to display it, and we might even not want to do that. We'll take a look in a second to see how that all goes. But for starters, we'll just run this to see what we get. In order to do that, we need to connect our menu link to this entity class. And so let's comment out this line and link to CRUD. This is going to be users, and our entity class is user CRUD controller. But what's this middle option here? Well, these are the icons that are going to be used when we view our page. And these icons come from Font Awesome. So if we jump over to Font Awesome and go looking, we'll see that we have an icon here for users. And this is the Font Awesome solid set. And so we can just say FAS and then FA users. If I did everything correctly, this should work just fine. Let's take another look at our admin dashboard. What we actually need here in the dashboard controller is not the controller name, but the entity name. So we need the app entity username right here. So that is going to be user. And here we are. We have a users section over here. And if we click on it, we can see this, but we're not seeing the roles. We still need to finish some of our configuration on that field, But I just wanted to go ahead and show you that we can see some things here, and we also have our edit and delete links here. Let's go back and finish the configuration on our choice field. There are a number of options we want to set on this field. We want to allow multiple choices. We want this to render expanded, or else it's going to create a weird list in our list set. And then we want to set the two roles that we have in an array. This is another gotcha right here. Normally you want your array key would be like this, and the array value would be the regular human viewable version. For these fields, it's actually backwards, where the visible part is the key and then the actual value is the value. Let's take a look at this again and see if we got this right this time. Now our user roles show up correctly, and when I come in here to edit, I can check and uncheck those things. But here's the problem. We don't really want to be able to edit the user ID. One of the options we have available on our fields is only on index, which means that it will display in the list, but we won't be able to edit it. Let's verify that that's working. We'll go back to the list. It's still here. But now when we go to edit, we only have the username and the roles that we can change. We're definitely missing something here. We're missing the password. And setting the password is going to take a fair amount of work, because we need to be able to enter the plain text password, and we should probably go ahead and set up to enter it twice to make sure it matches. And then we have to encrypt the password before we actually store it back to the record. That's what makes this user controller one of the more tricky pieces to manage. First, we want to add the password type and the repeated type, because it's repeated type that will let us make the double field. Now I'm going to add the password field on the form, and we're going to look through it step by step to make sure we understand what everything does. So we have a text field called plain password. The form type is a repeated type. Inside that form type, we're going to set some form options. First, we're going to say the type is password type. We're going to set an invalid message that tells the user that the fields must match if it's invalid. We're going to add a class of password field for our CSS. And then we're going to set up two different things here. Our first option is going to set the label of password. Our second option is going to set repeat password. I'm going to get rid of this change, and I'm going to set this field to false. It won't be required, which means we're only going to check and change the password if it's filled in. We're going to hide on index, which means we don't want to show this field in the list of users. And we're going to hide on detail, which is something we haven't talked about yet, but we do have the option to view a detailed view of an entity type inside of the admin interface. But now we have a problem. We've created a new property for our entity type called plain password, and that does not exist. We don't want to include that property in the database, so we're not going to set it up as a full field. We do need it to be on our user entity type. In our user entity type, we've declared a number of properties. You may or may not know, in PHP, you can specify any property on an object, and it will automatically add that property as a public property for the life of that object. So this is something we won't store in the database, but we can simply create our getters and setters for a plain password and set up a fake this plain password property that can be set and then can be retrieved. And we'll set the default that if we try to retrieve it before it is set, it will simply return a null. By adding this getter and setter to our entity type, we should now be able to edit this on the edit form. However, we haven't made anything yet that will save the actual password. And I'm just going to type some random characters and hit save. And it should come up with an error and says that the password fields must match. That's exactly what we wanted to have happen. I'm really not a fan of tutorials that claim to be beginner tutorials and then paste a bunch of advanced code without really explaining what's going on. Unfortunately, it would probably take too long for me to fully explain everything that needs to be added to this class in order to make it work. In order to store the password from this fake plain password field, we need to override both the persist entity method, which is the method that this controller uses to save a new entity, and the update entity method, which this controller would use to update an existing entity, and check plain password, make sure it's set, and if it is set, hash that password and save it. So even though I'm not going to go into everywhere I looked to find this information, I do want to make sure that I make it clear what it does. First of all, we need one more thing. We need that password hasher again that we used back in the early part of this series to create a password in the first place. So we're going to use Symfony's password hasher interface in order to import this service so that we can use it in multiple methods below. We're going to have to add it using the class constructor. PHP's class constructor is a magic function that runs whenever an object is created, including this controller object. We'll add the constructor, and using Symfony's auto wiring, we will insert the password hasher, and then we'll create a service called this password hasher. It's probably a good idea to actually declare that. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's take a quick look at what we've got so far without digging into this code. We need the Entity Manager interface to be defined also. Now let's go down and look at our persist entity method. I should note that there are other ways to do this, including setting up an event handler, but this was the quickest and simplest way I could figure out to do this. We simply want to hash and set a new password if it's provided. And so we'll just check and make sure that we can get plain password from our entity instance. If we can't, or it's empty, then we know the password wasn't changed and we don't have to do anything except go ahead and call the parent persist entity method, which is the default for this class. However, if we did find a plain password, then we need to create a hashed password and then simply use the entity instance set password to set this hashed password. Just to be clear, the entity instance is our instance of user that was returned from the form. When we do forms in Symfony, it's going to pass an object, and in this case, the form is going to pass that user object. And so the entity instance here, when we go to persist it, is the copy of user that we are manipulating. So we'll check for a plain password, we'll hash one if we find it, we will set the hashed password, and then persist the entity as normal. And we've done the same code down here for updating entities. This is redundant, and there might be other ways we could avoid duplicating code. But again, this is a quick and simple solution that's going to let us change our user's password. So let's see if this all works. Rather than risk breaking my admin user on the first time out, I'm going to add a new user. My name is Micah. My password is password. And I am not an administrator. I am simply a user. Let's hit create. And then let's go back to our application, which we can't do easily quite yet. And log out. And log back in. And sure enough, I am logged in and it says watch list for me now. And I don't have a watch list because we didn't create one for this user yet. If you remember, we tied all of our watch list entries to the admin user. However, I have full access to the administration dashboard here. Setting up security for this goes beyond the scope of this tutorial, but I am going to verify that I can edit my own password and save. And I can sign out from here. Yes, so that's one way to do this, and log back in. And now I have a working user CRUD functions. I do have a couple of things in my dashboard that I'd like to fix. First of all, I'd like to be able to get back to my site. And second of all, this ellipsis here is really annoying, and I'd really rather just be able to see these entities in the list. Let's go make a couple of quick changes to our dashboard controller for those things. I can configure CRUD options on each CRUD controller, or I can set it globally here in the dashboard. Let's add a configure CRUD method in our dashboard that first sets the parent configure CRUD and then also adds a setting of show entity actions inline. Now if I use this dashboard, I'm reminded that again, I forgot a step. I referenced the CRUD object here, but I forgot to include it up at the top. This looks much better. We can actually see what's happening here. We can also adjust what options are available here. For that, we'll go back to our user CRUD controller. First, we're going to need to use config actions and config CRUD. We're going to configure actions to manipulate the default actions. On the index page, we'll add the option to detail an item. And on the edit page, we'll add an option to go back to the index or to detail the item. We can also add an action here to disable deleting users at all. That might be a good idea for this project too. I actually need action and actions and CRUD for this to work. So again, here are our users, and now our buttons have changed to show and edit. I can show a user, and that gives me that detail, and I get back to listing here, or I can hit edit. Once I'm in edit, you see I have the option to show or go back to the listing, along with my original buttons of save, to save and edit, or just simply save. So now I can get back to the listing from here. Speaking of getting back to places, there's one more thing we want to get back to, and that's back to our site from our dashboard. As far as I can tell, I can't fix the link here to get me back to the dashboard, so instead we'll add a link to this menu. If you look at our configure menu items in our dashboard controller, we have a menu item to link to dashboard, which is our home link, inside the dashboard. We have a menu item to link to CRUD, which is our link to our users page. And now we'll add a link to route to return to our site, and you would think we could just go back to the front page. However, if we do that, it causes a little bit of a mess. When I return to site, I'm not actually on the home page. If you see, I'm still in the admin menu with the route name of front page. I would prefer a clean return back to the actual front page, and for that we're going to need to add a quick route with a redirect. Let's go ahead and add another route in this controller to /return, named return to site. This is going to be a redirect response, so we need that type as well. And we will give this a name return to site, and we will link to this route. This route is simply going to redirect us back to the home page cleanly. It seems kind of silly and it might not be necessary, but this bothered me, and so I worked this out as a solution. Let's go back into admin, and now when we hit return to site, we actually end up back on the home page without being in the admin URL anymore. I think that's much cleaner. I know that this video is going to get a little bit longer than the previous ones, but we still have 2 more entity types that we need to set up, so please bear with me as I go through those as quickly as I can. The user entity CRUD is definitely the most difficult. Let's go ahead and make both CRUD controllers right off the bat. And we'll jump in and add their menu items as well. Don't forget, we need to specify those entity types up here first. Now I have platform, show, and user. Here's a TV icon. And a store. And a store might be the best for our platform class. Let's take a quick look at just how this looks in the menu. And then let's look at CRUD for our platforms. We don't really need to show or edit the platform ID on this object at all. We didn't really need to show it on users either, but I feel a little weird not seeing a user ID. The CRUD for our platform is simply the ID and the name. We don't have to handle links to shows in this section at all. So really the only field we need is name. Come back to our user CRUD controller and grab the namespace for our text field. Put that up here. We have a text field of name. And that should be about all we need for this particular CRUD controller, unless we want to mess with these configuration options. So we have the text field of the name, and I think that's all we actually need for our platforms. We have our current platforms of Netflix, Prime, Paramount Plus, and Hulu. And let's just go ahead and make sure this works. We'll add Disney Plus. That is now on the list as well. Or if we prefer, we can come back and spell that out. Either way, this is working just fine now, so that was a quick one. Let's move on to shows. Again, we don't need ID, but we will have the text field. If we look at our show entity type, we'll have the ID, the show title. So that one's good. But then we have the user and the platform. How are we going to set those up? For this, we'll need to add an association field. Actually, 2. And I almost forgot, we also need a number field for the ranking. So let's add that here before I forget. As it turns out, again, one of the more difficult things we normally have to do when writing a PHP application is very, very simple. We simply need to add an association field for user and for platform, which are the property names for user and platform in our entity type. Then we'll also add a number field for our rating. And we don't have a show description, so let's remove that. Click on shows, and here we are. Here are our shows. And we might want to add some CRUD options for this. I think it would be nice if we could at least see the details. So again, we need action. We need our config action, actions, and CRUD from our user CRUD controller. Then we'll grab our configure actions method, copy it over. But I think in this case, it's going to be perfectly fine to delete entities. So we're simply going to add the action, the detail action, and the ability to get back to the index. So now we can view this entity and see all of the details. We do have a minor problem here though, I see. We're only showing user number 1 and platform number 3. While this is valid and we could edit this, this is where we see we have a real problem in our code. We need to be able to convert the user and probably also convert platform to a string. For this, we're going to need the toString magic method on both of those classes. So on user, we'll come down and we'll add toString, returns a string, and we'll simply return this username. On the platform, we'll do the same, but we'll return this name because that should be the property of the platform name. Yes, it's name. I forgot the word function. Now we see that we have the correct username and the platform name, and when we go to edit this, we actually have a drop down and we can choose from our platforms and we can choose from our existing users. I know that was a lot. This is displaying as show number 1, and I'd probably want to go back and fix that too, but I don't really want to spend any more time on this tutorial. I know this last video was long and detailed, but hopefully you'll be able to go back and look through the code and see how it was built and why it was built, and then start adding your own ideas to this project. Again, this is just the start of a project. We don't have very good security. Right now, I'm logged in as a non-admin user, and yet I can still do just about anything I want. Definitely want to lock down some of the admin interfaces, add restrictions, but hopefully this has given you a look into how Symfony entities work, how they tie together, and how you can write some fairly simple code to tie 3 different entity types together and get a quick, easy display of the information. I hope you enjoyed this series. Thanks for watching.